The Eightfold Path is practiced in early Buddhist communities. There is a quiet ache that runs beneath human life, an unease so familiar that we often mistake it for normality. It is present in moments of abundance as much as in moments of loss. Even when circumstances seem favorable, something within us remains restless, subtly unsatisfied, reaching forward or recoiling backward, rarely at rest in the simple fact of being alive. This unease is not a personal failure, nor is it a modern invention. It is as old as consciousness itself. In the forests, villages, and dusty roads of ancient India, people felt it just as we do now, though their lives were outwardly simpler. The Buddha did not speak to an age of machines and glowing screens, yet he addressed this same inward turbulence with startling clarity. The Eightfold Path emerged not as a philosophy to admire, but as a way of living, meant to be walked step by step, breath by breath, within real communities of human beings who struggled, failed, learned, and slowly awakened together. When we hear the phrase Eightfold Path today, it often sounds abstract, distant, perhaps even ceremonial. It can feel like a list preserved in texts, rather than a living rhythm of life. Yet in the earliest Buddhist communities, the path was not separated from daily activity. It was woven into how people spoke to one another, how they earned their food, how they walked through villages, and how they faced fear, illness, conflict, and death. It was practiced not in isolation from the world, but in intimate contact with it. The path shaped not only individual minds, but entire ways of relating, creating a culture grounded in restraint, clarity, compassion, and deep responsibility for one's inner life. To understand the Eightfold Path, as it was practiced then, is not to travel backward in time for the sake of history. It is to rediscover a mode of living that remains quietly radical even now. In a world that trains us to divide our lives into work and rest, belief and behavior, inner life and outer success, the early Buddhist communities offer another possibility, a life in which understanding, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and stillness are not separate compartments, but facets of a single, coherent way of being. To sit beside that ancient campfire, even imaginatively, is to be reminded that liberation was never meant to be distant or dramatic. It was meant to be practiced in the ordinary, with patience, humility, and unwavering attention. In the earliest Buddhist communities, the Eightfold Path was not approached as a ladder to climb or a checklist to complete. It was understood more like a living ecosystem, where each aspect supported and refined the other. The people who gathered around the Buddha, whether ordained monastics or lay followers, did not wake each morning thinking in terms of numbered steps. They woke to the simple question of how to live without causing further harm, how to see clearly without being consumed by craving or fear, and how to cultivate a mind capable of peace even amid uncertainty. The path was the answer not because it promised escape from life, but because it taught them how to inhabit life without being torn apart by it. Right understanding, in those early communities, was not an intellectual position one defended in debate. It was a gradual, experiential recognition of how suffering arises and how it fades. People learned this understanding not only through listening to teachings, but through watching their own minds in moments of disappointment, anger, longing. When a monk felt irritation toward a fellow practitioner, or when a layperson felt envy toward a neighbor, these experiences became teachers. Over time, it grew clear that suffering was not imposed from outside alone, but was shaped from within by grasping, aversion, and confusion. This recognition softened the impulse to blame the world and redirected attention inward, not in a self-obsessed way, but in a deeply responsible one, to see clearly was to accept that freedom depended on understanding the workings of one's own mind. From this understanding naturally arose right intention, though it was rarely spoken of as something dramatic or heroic. Intention in early Buddhist life meant a quiet alignment of the heart, away from cruelty, exploitation, and compulsive desire, and toward renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. This did not mean suppressing human feeling or withdrawing from relationship. It meant learning to notice the subtle motivations that preceded speech and action. Before words were spoken, there was a moment of choice. Before an action was taken, there was an inward leaning. Communities practiced becoming sensitive to these moments, recognizing that intention shaped the quality of both personal peace and collective harmony. Over time, the atmosphere of such communities changed. Conversations grew simpler, conflicts less inflamed, and even silence took on a shared dignity. Right speech was perhaps one of the most visible expressions of the path in communal life. In an age before written messages and digital distance, speech carried immense weight. Words could bind a community together or tear it apart. Early practitioners trained themselves to speak truthfully, but also gently, to refrain from gossip and harshness, and to recognize when silence was wiser than commentary. This was not always easy. Old habits followed people into monastic life, just as they follow us now into any new commitment. Yet the communal emphasis on mindful speech created a mirror. When someone spoke carelessly, the discomfort was felt not as punishment, but as an invitation to greater awareness. Over time, speech became less about asserting identity and more about serving understanding. Right action extended this mindfulness into the body. The early Buddhist communities placed great importance on bodily conduct, not out of moral rigidity, but because actions left imprints on the mind. To refrain from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct was not framed merely as obedience to rules. It was understood as a way of reducing agitation, remorse, and fear. When the body acted in harmony with non-harming, the mind found it easier to settle. This insight was deeply practical. People noticed how a single careless act could disturb sleep, meditation, and trust within the community. Conversely, simple acts of restraint and kindness created a sense of safety that supported deeper practice for everyone. Livelihood, too, was seen as inseparable from the path. In early Buddhist societies, lay followers were encouraged to earn their living in ways that did not directly harm others. This guidance was not idealistic in the sense of ignoring economic realities, but it did invite careful reflection. Work was not neutral. It shaped one's daily state of mind. A livelihood rooted in deception, exploitation, constantly stirred restlessness and fear. By contrast, work aligned with ethical clarity supported inner stability. For monastics, livelihood took the form of reliance on alms, a practice that cultivated humility and interdependence. It reminded both giver and receiver that life was sustained through relationship, not self-sufficiency. Right effort in these communities was not a grim striving or a forceful battle against the mind. It was a steady, patient commitment to cultivating wholesome states and letting go of unwholesome ones. Practitioners learned to recognize when effort became tense and counterproductive, and when it slipped into laziness or distraction. The middle way here was discovered through lived experience. A monk sitting in meditation might notice agitation when trying too hard, or dullness when not trying enough. Over time, effort became refined into a quality of attentive care, rather than sheer willpower. This understanding was shared communally, through observation, conversation, and quiet example. Mindfulness was perhaps the thread that wove all these aspects together. In early Buddhist life, mindfulness was not limited to formal meditation periods. It extended into walking, eating, listening, and resting. Communities developed a shared sensitivity to presence, a bowl held with care, a step taken with awareness, a pause before responding to a difficult remark. These were expressions of mindfulness as much as sitting in silence. This continuous awareness allowed practitioners to see impermanence directly, not as an idea, but as an intimate fact. Feelings arose and passed, thoughts shifted, bodies aged. Rather than clinging to stability where none could be found, mindfulness taught a gentle intimacy with change itself. Stillness, often associated with meditative absorption, was valued not as an escape from life, but as a way of clarifying it. Periods of deep quiet allowed the mind to rest from its habitual commentary and reactivity. In early communities, such stillness was supported by simple living and mutual respect. Silence was not enforced, but honored. From this stillness, insight emerged naturally, reshaping how practitioners understood themselves and others. The sense of a fixed, separate self softened, replaced by a more fluid and compassionate perception of experience. Taken together, the Eightfold Path, as practiced in early Buddhist communities, formed a coherent way of life, rather than a theoretical system. It addressed suffering, not by denying it or explaining it away, but by transforming the conditions that gave rise to it. Each aspect of the path was lived in relationship with teachers, companions, lay supporters, and the wider world. Liberation was not imagined as an individual triumph, but as a shared unfolding of clarity and kindness. This way of practice reminds us that the path was never meant to be distant or decorative. It was meant to be walked together in the dust and silence of ordinary day. As the early Buddhist communities matured, the Eightfold Path revealed itself not only as a personal discipline, but as a subtle architecture shaping collective life. It influenced how disagreements were resolved, how authority was understood, and how vulnerability was held within the group. These communities were not ideal utopias free from tension. They were made of human beings, carrying habits formed long before robes were worn or vows were taken. Yet the path offered a shared reference point, a quiet standard that redirected energy away from domination and toward understanding. In this way, practice became something that happened between people as much as within them. One of the most striking features of early Buddhist communal life was the way restraint was held as a form of freedom rather than deprivation. To modern ears, restraint often sounds like loss, a narrowing of option. But within these communities, restraint was experienced as a release from compulsions that had long governed behavior. By voluntarily simplifying life, practitioners discovered an unexpected spaciousness. Fewer possessions meant fewer worry. Fewer entertainments meant a clearer awareness of the mind's movements. This simplicity was not romanticized. It was practical, sometimes uncomfortable, and always revealing. Each moment of discomfort became an opportunity to observe craving without immediately obeying it. The relationship between monastics and lay followers further illustrated how the path functioned as a living system. Lay people supported monastics materially, offering food, shelter, and basic necessities. In return, they received not promises of reward, but the presence of people committed to living with clarity and restraint. This exchange was not transactional in a narrow sense. It was relational and symbolic, reminding everyone involved that spiritual practice was inseparable from generosity and trust. The layperson giving alms practiced letting go, while the monastic receiving practiced humility. Both participated in dissolving the illusion of self-sufficiency that so often deepens suffering. Within the monastic communities themselves, the Eightfold Path shaped how discipline was understood. Rules existed, but they were not meant to be wielded as weapons of control. They functioned as supports for mindfulness and harmony. When a rule was broken, The emphasis was on acknowledgement and restoration rather than punishment. This approach required courage and honesty. To admit a mistake publicly was not easy, yet it cultivated a culture where concealment was less attractive than clarity. Over time, this transparency strengthened trust and reduced the fear that so often distorts communal life. Sangha, central though it was, did not exist in isolation from ethical conduct and understanding. Early practitioners recognized that a mind agitated by remorse or conflict rarely settled into stillness. Thus, meditation was supported by the whole of the path. When someone struggled in meditation, the guidance was often surprisingly ordinary. Attend to your speech, simplify your actions, look carefully at how you earn and use resources. In this way, meditation was grounded in daily life rather than elevated above it. Stillness became a natural flowering of a life lived with care. As insight deepened, practitioners began to experience directly the teaching of non-self, not as a doctrine but as a shift in perception. In meditation and mindful activity, thoughts, emotions, and sensations appeared less as possessions and more as events. Anger arose and passed, joy shimmered and faded. Even the sense of I was seen to be unstable, dependent on conditions. This realization was not dramatic for everyone. For many, it emerged quietly, like a gradual loosening rather than a sudden collapse. Yet its implications were profound. When the self was no longer held as a solid center needing constant defense, compassion arose more easily. Others' suffering was no longer so easily dismissed or resented. This shift toward compassion was not sentimental. It was grounded in the recognition of shared vulnerability. Early Buddhist communities were intimately acquainted with illness, aging, and death. There were no illusions of permanent youth or endless progress. When a practitioner fell ill, others attended to them. When someone died, the community reflected together on impermanence. These moments were not avoided or hidden. They were integrated into practice as reminders of what mattered. The Eightfold Path offered a way to face these realities without collapsing into despair or denial. Conflict, when it arose, was approached through dialogue and reflection rather than force. Right speech and right intention served as guiding lights. Participants were encouraged to speak honestly while remaining attentive to the impact of their words. Listening was valued as much as speaking. This emphasis did not eliminate conflict, but it transformed its role. Disagreements became opportunities to observe attachment and aversion in real time. Through this process, communities learned that harmony was not the absence of difference, but the capacity to meet difference without violence. The rhythm of daily life in these early communities reinforced the path in subtle ways. Regular periods of silence allowed the mind to rest from social performance. Communal gatherings reminded individuals that they were part of something larger than their private concerns. Work, whether sweeping a path or preparing food, was treated as practice rather than distraction. These ordinary activities provided endless occasions to notice impatience, pride, or carelessness, and to gently reorient toward awareness. Importantly, the Eightfold Path was never presented as something one could complete and set aside. It was understood as an ongoing cultivation, responsive to changing conditions. A practitioner who had stabilized ethical conduct might need to deepen mindfulness. One who experienced clarity in meditation might discover subtle attachments still shaping behavior. This dynamic understanding prevented complacency and encouraged humility. No one was regarded as finished. Even the most respected elders modeled continued learning and refinement. The communal nature of practice also offered protection against extremes. When someone became overly austere or rigid, others could gently remind them of balance. When another drifted into laxity or distraction, the collective rhythm helped bring them back. In this way, the path functioned not as an individual obsession, but as a shared compass. It oriented life toward liberation without demanding uniformity of temperament or experience. Seen through this lens, the Eightfold Path, as practiced in early Buddhist communities, appears less like an ancient formula and more like a living conversation between wisdom and circumstance. It adapted to seasons, personalities, and challenges without losing its essential direction. Its power lay not in its complexity, but in its coherence. Each aspect supported the others, forming a way of life capable of meeting suffering with intelligence and care. This living quality is perhaps what allowed the path to endure, carried not only in texts, but in the lived experience of countless practitioners who discovered day by day that freedom was possible within the ordinary fabric of human life. When we turn our attention from the forests and villages of early Buddhist communities to the dense, accelerated world we now inhabit, the distance can feel vast. Our lives are saturated with noise, information, and constant self-reference. We move quickly, often without feeling our own movement, and we speak endlessly, often without listening. Yet the Eightfold Path, as it was lived long ago, does not lose relevance in this context. On the contrary, its original form speaks with particular clarity to a world that has learned to multiply desire, while forgetting how to rest. One of the most striking lessons the early communities offer us is the inseparability of inner life and outer form. Today, spirituality is often treated as something private and internal, a matter of beliefs, feelings, or occasional practices inserted into an otherwise unquestioned way of living. The early practitioners would have found this division strange. For them, how one spoke, worked, consumed, and related was not peripheral to awakening. It was the field in which awakening either matured or withered. The path was not something practiced in spite of life, but through it. This understanding challenges us gently but firmly. It asks whether our own attempts at mindfulness are supported or undermined by the structures of our daily existence. Consider speech in our time. Words travel faster and farther than ever before, often stripped of tone, context, and consequence. It is easy to speak impulsively, to react before understanding, to reduce complex human beings to symbols in an argument. Early Buddhist communities trained themselves to feel the weight of speech in the body and heart before releasing it into the world. They understood that speech shaped not only relationships but the speaker's own mind. To practice right speech now is not to retreat into silence, but to rediscover this sense of weight and care. It is to remember that every word participates in shaping the mental environment we all inhabit. The same is true of action and livelihood. Modern economies often obscure the consequences of what we do and what we consume. Harm is displaced, hidden behind systems and screens. Early practitioners did not have the luxury of such distance. Their actions reverberated immediately within small communities. This proximity fostered responsibility. While we cannot simply replicate their conditions, we can learn from their attentiveness. To ask how our work affects our own minds and the lives of others is already to step back onto the path as it was originally walked. It is to reclaim agency in a world that encourages moral numbness. The early communities also remind us of the power of simplicity, not as an aesthetic preference, but as a support for clarity. Simplicity in those contexts was not about purity or superiority. It was about reducing unnecessary agitation. In our time, complexity is often mistaken for richness and constant stimulation for vitality. Yet many of us sense, even if we cannot articulate it, that this abundance leaves us strangely depleted. The restraint practiced by early Buddhists was a way of listening more deeply to life. It created space for the mind to reveal its patterns without distraction. To experiment with even small acts of simplification today can reopen that space, allowing insight to arise where noise once dominated. Perhaps the most challenging and transformative aspect of the Eightfold Path for modern practitioners is its communal dimension. We are taught to imagine growth as an individual project, measured by personal achievement or private insight. Early Buddhist communities knew better. They understood that the self is relational, shaped continuously by contact with others. Practicing together was not optional. It was essential. Others reflected our blind spots, steadied us when we faltered, and reminded us of our intentions when we forgot them. Without such mirrors, self-deception flourished. In a fragmented society, rebuilding genuine communities of practice is not easy. Yet the principle remains vital. Whether through small groups, friendships grounded in honesty, or even the unseen community formed through shared listening and reflection, the path requires relationship. Awakening was never imagined as an escape from humanity, but as a deeper entrance into it, freed from the compulsions that distort connection. The early practitioners' intimacy with impermanence also carries a message we are often reluctant to hear. They did not treat change as an inconvenience to be managed or postponed. They lived with the understanding that bodies age, possessions decay, and relationships transform or end. This awareness did not lead them to nihilism, but to care. Knowing that nothing could be held forever, they learned to meet each moment more fully, without the desperation to freeze it in place. In our time, where permanence is promised and rarely delivered, this teaching offers both sobering realism and profound relief. We do not have to secure life against loss in order to love it. As non-self was glimpsed more deeply in early practice, it softened the grip of comparison and self-importance. Without a solid self to defend or enhance, energy was freed for understanding and compassion. This insight is especially needed now, when identity is constantly reinforced and contested. The early path does not ask us to erase individuality, but to see its constructed nature. From that seeing arises a freedom that is neither passive nor indifferent. It is responsive, flexible, and deeply humane. In this light, the Eightfold Path appears not as a relic of a distant culture, but as a living response to the conditions of suffering wherever they arise. Its early communal expression shows us that awakening is not a matter of adopting correct ideas, but of reshaping how life is lived at every level. It invites us to bring understanding into intention, intention into speech, speech into action, and action into the quiet depths of the mind. This integration is slow, often imperfect, and always unfinished. Yet it is precisely this humility that gives the path its enduring strength. To sit with the early Buddhist communities in imagination is to encounter a way of life that trusted simplicity over accumulation, awareness over distraction, and relationship over isolation. The Eightfold Path, as they practiced it, was not a doctrine held at a distance, but a daily commitment renewed in countless small moments. It met suffering not with denial or dramatic promises, but with careful attention and steady care. It assumed that freedom was possible, not because life could be controlled, but because the mind could learn to see clearly and respond wisely. In our own time, the conditions are different, yet the heart of the matter remains unchanged. We still suffer when we cling, still find peace when we release, still long for meaning beneath the surface of our busyness. The early path does not demand that we abandon our world, only that we enter it more consciously. It invites us to walk, speak, work, and rest with an awareness that honors both our vulnerability and our capacity for awakening. If these reflections have resonated, let them do so quietly. There is no need to rush or to turn insight into performance. Let it settle, like embers glowing after a fire has burned low. And if you wish to continue exploring this ancient path, as it unfolds within modern life, you are warmly invited to stay connected with this channel, where these conversations deepen slowly, patiently, and together.